So this video lesson is going to be all about measuring using the metric system. And so before we get into actually measuring using the metric system, I want you to take a second. I'm going to ask you to pause the video here in a second. But I want you to take a second and see how many different units of measurement that you can come up with. Now I'm going to give you one or two as an example of the kinds of things that I want you to think about. And then I want you to just create a list, spend 30 seconds, maybe a minute, just writing down as many different types of units as you can. So I'm going to start you off with some things like feet. We can measure in feet, or we can also measure in pounds for how we measure weight, or we can also measure in, let's see, we'll say cups, something that we can measure both liquid and solid in. So go ahead and think for about 30 seconds to a minute. Go ahead and pause the video and just write down as many different measurement units as you can think of. So going along the same line as feet, some of the things you could come up with that were similar were inches, yards, miles. Maybe you came up with some other types of measurements that aren't related to feet, inches, yards, and miles quite so easily. There are things like meters, kilometers, centimeters, millimeters, decimeters, etc. Related to pounds, and you didn't have to come up with things just related like this, but I'm going to come up with some of these things in this way. Related to pounds, we have ounces. We also have tons, which is the same as 2,000 pounds. But we also have for things, there's pounds measures weight, but there are other things that could be thought of similarly that are not the same, like kilograms, grams, milligrams. And with cups related to liquids, we have cups, pints, quarts, gallons, etc. And some other ways we can think about those liquids are things like milliliters, centiliters, liters, kiloliters. All of these things are all different units of measurement. They represent different types of things. On the far left-hand column, we have units of length or distance. In the center column here, we have units of, well, for the pounds, ounces, and tons, it's weight. For the kilograms, grams, and milligrams, we talk about what's called mass. And on the far right, we have things for liquid. But I wrote them in two different colors for a specific reason. Perhaps not most, but many of the examples that you're likely to come up with would have been examples in what we call the customary system. Systems that are primarily used in the United States. Now, if you were born or spent a lot of time outside the United States, that may not be true. But if you were born in the United States and spent a lot of time here, then that is likely one of the things that you came up with. Maybe you came up with some of the metric ones, but it's likely that you came up with primarily ones for the customary system, which makes sense because that is the types of measurements that we use most often in the United States. However, there's a whole different type of measurement system called the metric system that is used in most places elsewhere in the world, that is based on things like meters, kilometers, milligrams, liters, centiliters, kilograms, etc. So looking at these three categories of units that we came up with, where we had length, we had mass, and we had what we call capacity, I'm going to take a second and just review the different types of measurements, how they relate to each other, and some basic examples of how big or how much, or for what we can feel, more or less how heavy for mass something is when we talk about it with the metric system. So we're going to start with length. And in the metric system, every different type of measurement starts with one basic unit. For length, that one basic unit is the meter. Everything is based around the meter. The meter is about the size, the height of the chairs that we have in the classroom. If we wanted to go very small, if you looked at a dime and just considered how thick a dime is, that would give you a millimeter, very, very small. A centimeter, not the size on the screen, but if you took a large paper clip and measured its width, that would give you what's called about a centimeter as a matter of comparison for finding out just how long that is. And a kilometer not often called a kilometer, but could be, but we call it a kilometer. If you combined the length of 9 football fields, you would have about the length of 1 kilometer. So some very, very small units, like millimeters and centimeters, some units that are of a moderate length, like meters, or we can talk about something called a decameter, which we'll get to in a later class, or units of even farther length, like kilometers. But notice that in each of these different measurement units, we see the word meter. And that's going to be important for not only the class that we get to tomorrow, but also some later classes with the metric system. If we talk about capacity, capacity is the amount that a container can hold. And we generally are more familiar with talking about capacity when it relates to a liquid. So we are used in the United States of hearing things in gallons, half gallons, quarts, pints, etc. While using the metric system, everything is based around a liter, which would be about 1 large water bottle. Now, if you wanted a comparison, it takes a little bit less than 4 liters to make up 1 gallon. So if you split a gallon into somewhere between 3 and 4 equal parts, you would have something about the unit of a liter. But a large water bottle is 1 liter, or you may be familiar with 1 liter or 2 liter bottles of soda. If you wanted to go for the very, very small with capacity, you could get to a milliliter, which if you think about the difference between a millimeter and a meter, the difference between the width of a dime and the height of a chair, it's the same kind of idea between the capacity of a water bottle and the capacity for the water in an eyedropper. Which if you think eyedroppers are very, very small, that capacity is tiny, whereas at least compared to that, a large water bottle is huge. But if we wanted to go completely to the other end, to the very big, to the kiloliter, if you imagine you had 8 large trash cans, perhaps similar to the ones that you might put out on the street for trash or recycling pickup, then you have about a kiloliter if you combine 8 of those trash cans. And the final thing that we were talking about with the metric system is the idea of mass, which is not the same as weight. But mass is the amount of matter that's in an object, the amount of stuff that's in an object. So the basic unit of mass is called a gram. Now, a gram is actually relatively small compared to things that we're used to talking about. We have things like paper clips. A small paper clip has about a gram of mass. And that is not very big at all, at least when we compare things like a meter is the height of a chair or a liter is the size of a large water bottle. A gram is comparatively small based on things that we're used to saying. A milligram, when we go all the way back to the small unit, a milligram is about the amount of mass in 1 singular grain of sugar. And a kilogram is about the amount of mass in a textbook, perhaps like our math textbook. And even that, compared to some things that we're used to seeing, humans, cars, desks, things like that, even a kilogram is not a terribly large unit of mass. But these are the basic units of the metric system. A gram for mass, a liter for capacity, and a meter for length. So the 3 types of units that we've talked about with the metric system have been the distance for length, capacity for the amount that a container can hold, and the amount of matter that an object has, which is also called its mass. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video here, and I want you to come up with, now if you need to look back at the slides real quick, I want you to go ahead, you can go ahead and do that, but I want you to come up with a few different things that we're going to talk about in class. First, I want you to come up with 2 or 3 different units that we can use to measure in each of these 3 different categories, length, capacity, and mass. And I want them to be metric units. After all, we're talking about the metric system. And try to do these without looking back at the different parts of the video. But I also want you to come up with 2 or 3 examples of things that we could measure using each of those units. What could we measure the mass of? Something that we could measure the capacity of. Something that we could measure the length of. And come up with not just the units, but things that we would measure using those units. So go ahead and pause the video and come back when you're done. Now, real quick, we'll review those units that we talked about. For length, we talked about millimeters, centimeters, meters, and kilometers. In capacity, we talked about milliliters, liters, and kiloliters. And in mass, we talked about milligrams, grams, and kilograms. I'm going to leave the 2 or 3 things that could be measured until we get to class tomorrow, and we'll do an activity at the beginning of class relating to the measurement of those particular things that you mentioned using each of these units. But I want to take a quick look at the relationship between the milligram, the gram, and the kilogram. We said that it takes 1,000 milligrams to make up a gram, and then it takes 1,000 grams to make up a kilogram. And in general, the metric system takes their regular units, grams, liters, meters, and uses different parts or multiples of them to create different units of measurement. So a kilogram is just 1,000 grams. And so every unit in the metric system, kilometers, meters, centimeters, millimeters, kilograms, grams, milligrams, kiloliters, liters, milliliters, etc., each of those units is just based around whatever that most basic unit is. So if we're getting bigger, we use prefixes like deca, hecto, or kilo. And if we're getting smaller, we use units like deci, centa, and milli. So we will talk about that later, but it's important that you recognize when looking at the metric system and measuring with its units that each of its units is related to each other in this specific way, that they are all multiples in green or fractions in red of whatever that basic unit we're talking about is.